Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So Mark, we're taping this episode the weekend before the 2022 midterm elections, and I must confess that I'm feeling really uneasy. I try not to think about it, but intrusive thoughts keep finding their way into my mind.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, is there anything you can say to make me feel less uneasy? Like, any good jokes?
I do have a good joke, Joe.
All right.
And our listeners should know this is probably going to take a couple minutes to listen. So you can fast forward for 2 minutes in your podcast feed if you don't want to hear my joke, or you can sit tight and we'll see how it goes. So this guy was about to go on vacation, and he asked a friend of his to house sit his apartment. And while he had been on vacation for a few days, he called his friend and asked, "So how's everything going?" And the friend said, "Oh, I have bad news for you. Your cat died." And the guy was, "Oh my God, you can't do that. You can't just drop that on me." Like, what you should do is slowly build up to it. Like, first you tell me that the cat's stuck on the roof. And then you tell me that you're having trouble getting the cat off the roof, that you called the fire department and they're struggling with it. And then finally, after that, you might tell me that my cat died. And by that point, I'm ready for the bad news. But you can't just suddenly spring it on me. And the second guy says, okay, got it. Thanks. So the first guy says, "Do you have any other news?" And the second guy says, "Yeah, your mother's stuck on the roof." So
very good.
The midterms are stuck on the roof, Joe.
Yeah. Let's hope I'm not stuck on the roof this time next weekend. With that as our segue, let's plunge right into this week's topic. So this week's topic is about vaping. And what prompted me to ask you this question, Mark, is that my two children, who are now 20 and 17, a few years ago, I learned that they both experimented with vaping, and I actually found some paraphernalia in the case of my daughter. And it really freaked me out because as I mentioned last time, I've been an ardent non-smoker for my entire life. And I also had this experience of sitting on the safety committee at my son's high school as the parent volunteer. And instead of talking about things like, putting speed bumps outside the school so the kids don't get run over by cars, we were instead talking about things like researching and pricing of vape detectors to install in the bathrooms. And that really brought home to me this epidemic of youth vaping in particular, and got me thinking about and reading about the vaping industry and the way it intends to replace combustible cigarettes and markets itself as a smoking cessation product. So as we now approach a big FDA decision on whether to formally approve e-cigarettes as smoking cessation devices, I wanted to ask you the question of whether there's any redeeming value to vaping. Or is it, as I cynically suspect, just another scam by the big tobacco and what I would call the nicotine-industrial complex to keep people hooked? So what did you discover?
Well, thank you for an interesting question. They say that everything old is new again, and this week's topic is a good example of that. Vaping is relatively new. The first e-cigarettes didn't hit the American market until 2005, and vaping didn't really take off until 2016. But the issues it presents are things we've been dealing with for a very long time.
Right.
So let's start by talking about what vaping is. The term vaping refers to the use of an electronic cigarette that contains a battery and heating element to vaporize a liquid that contains a complicated mix of chemicals, including glycerin, flavoring agents, and substances like nicotine, which for centuries people have been getting by way of cigars, cigarettes, and pipe smoking, or THC, which is the psychoactive substance in cannabis. The heating element doesn't burn anything. It just produces an aerosol, so there's no smoke coming out of an e-cigarette. If you see someone drawing on an e-cigarette and puffing out a cloud of what looks like smoke or steam, that's an aerosolized vapor. Technically, it's not steam because steam is the gaseous form of water, and there's no water in a vape cartridge. It's an aerosolized vapor of the chemicals inside that cartridge. Might be a little pedantic, but I always thought that was steam, so that's one thing that I learned.
Yeah, it looks like steam, that's for sure.
Sure. Vaping has been on the rise over the last few years, while cigarette smoking is in decline in the U.S. So today, vaping and smoking are just about equally common among American tobacco users. Have you ever personally vaped, Joe?
No, never vaped, and I've never even smoked a cigarette, so I'm probably an outlier here.
I have vaped. When cannabis was legalized in the state of Washington, I wanted to see what the experience was like. And after a lifetime of, like you, avoiding cigarettes, I wasn't about to smoke a joint. And so that left me with two options, edibles and vape pens. And I confess that I've tried both. After a handful of experiences, some enjoyable, others not so much, I eventually decided that cannabis isn't for me, and that brought an end to my exploration. But I do know what vaping is like firsthand. But anyway, when vaping was new on the scene, there were claims that it was a healthy alternative to smoking. Those claims have been largely debunked, but there are still some advantages to vaping within a specific scenario. And that scenario is one which you just alluded to. If you are a smoker and you are trying to quit, multiple studies suggest that vaping can be a helpful intermediate stage on the way to that goal. A study in 2019 found that habitual smokers who switched to vaping on a regular daily basis were twice as likely to succeed in eventually quitting than smokers who tried to go cold turkey or followed other smoking cessation programs. Another study in 2021 saw an even stronger effect. Daily e-cigarette usage among tobacco smokers increased the likelihood of quitting by 8-fold. And in the meantime, those smokers are better off because nearly every source agrees that e-cigarettes are able to clear the very low bar of being less unhealthy than smoking. If we were to imagine a hypothetical universe in which every cigarette smoker switches entirely to e-cigarettes, that would provide a significant benefit to society, mostly because cigarette smoking places such a large burden on the public health system. I should mention here that these results are not universally accepted. There are sources online that will tell you that vaping is just as bad as smoking. They question the studies I cited earlier, cite conflicting evidence, and argue that further study is needed before we can really know whether vaping is less unhealthy than cigarette smoking.
And I would add to what you just said, Mark, that we just don't know the long-term effects of vaping. I have this quote I saved to read to you today from an aerosol scientist who said, quote, "We're conducting a big, uncontrolled, and poorly documented set of chemistry experiments inside people's lungs," end quote.
Yeah, it's certainly true. But if we're just talking about the evidence on hand, the preponderance does appear to say so far that while e-cigarettes are in no way healthy, and I'll have quite a bit more to say about this later, they are less unhealthy than lighting up.
Yeah.
So that very limited point appears to be true.
Okay, fair enough.
So we can say this much. Switching to e-cigarettes does seem to help smokers quit, and vaping is likely to ruin those smokers' health at a slower rate than would happen if they continued to smoke. However, in nearly every other respect, vaping is a bad thing. First off, the liquid inside the vape cartridges can be dangerous if you swallow it or get it on your skin. So don't crack open those cartridges to see how the oil tastes. That would be a very bad idea. Second, when you vape, you're drawing chemical vapors into your lungs, and something like that is never going to come without risk. In 2021, researchers at Johns Hopkins University analyzed the aerosols of popular vape brands and found nearly 2,000 chemicals, the vast majority of which they were unable to identify. So it's kind of a chemical crapshoot, and even the stuff we know to be in there can be dangerous. For instance, let's take a look at nicotine. Tobacco smoking is addictive because of nicotine. Its positive psychoactive effects include reduced anxiety and stress, elevated mood, feelings of relaxation, and heightened concentration. I can say, even though I've never smoked a cigarette, I've inhaled a whole lot of secondhand smoke because my freshman roommate in college smoked like a chimney, and he cited many of these advantages for the reason that he did it.
Mm.
Nicotine increases your metabolism and reduces your appetite, so it can help you lose weight and keep it off. However, over time, you develop a tolerance for nicotine and need higher and higher doses to get the same effects. And when nicotine levels decline, withdrawal symptoms include anxiety, irritability, depressed mood, difficulty concentrating, increased hunger, and weight gain. So pretty much the exact opposite of all of the benefits of the nicotine high.
Right.
And if you've really been hitting the nicotine hard, you may experience something that is called hedonic dysregulation, which is the inability to experience pleasure in any way other than ingesting more nicotine. And this is why addictive substances are so hard to crack, because if you're full into the addiction, you arrive at a point where you effectively are unable to feel good except by way of using your drug.
Yeah, and by the way, this is one reason why Juul was, for a time at least, the most popular vaping cartridge, because each Juul pod had the equivalent nicotine of a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah.
So that's a ton of nicotine you're getting in your body.
Yeah. So nicotine, in short, is nothing to mess around with. And the amount of nicotine in e-cigarettes varies between brands and delivery methods. Sometimes it isn't even correctly indicated on the packaging, so it's hard to know for sure how much of a dose you're getting. And then there's lung disease. As I mentioned before, there's no smoke involved in vaping. And I also didn't find any source that suggested vaping, like cigarette smoking, causes lung cancer. However, that's not to say that vaping is not associated with lung disease. Quite the opposite, as a matter of fact. In 2019 and 2020, the country experienced an epidemic, and I'm not talking about COVID-19. Vaping-associated pulmonary injury, or VAPI, is an umbrella term for a variety of lung diseases associated with the use of vaping products that in some cases can be severe or even life-threatening. VAPI symptoms include shortness of breath, coughing, chest pain, stomach pain, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, fever, and extreme tiredness. The symptoms are similar to what you might experience if you came down with pneumonia, but patients do not respond to antibiotic therapy. A number of cases of VAPI were also initially misdiagnosed as COVID. According to the Center for Disease Controls, by 2020 there had been around 2,800 hospitalizations for VAPI, with 68 confirmed deaths.
Wow.
Yeah. VAPI appears to have been mostly but not exclusively associated with the use of vaping with cartridges that contained THC. 86% of people diagnosed with VAPI reported using THC-containing vape products. 34% exclusively used those products, while 64% reported using both THC and nicotine-containing products. The remaining 40% reported that they exclusively used nicotine vapes. So it's kind of a confusing landscape where most were THC users, but not all.
Yeah, and can I ask a dumb question? Because I don't know the answer to this. I've heard that statistic you just cited. It makes me curious about vaping THC. Is that something you could just buy at the store, like you can buy Juul cartridges to vape nicotine? Or is this some black market of illicit drugs that you have to buy from a dealer on the street? Do you know?
It depends on which state you live in. If you live in Washington, California, Denver, or one of the other states that have legalized cannabis, then yes, you can walk in with an ID, prove that you're an adult, and walk out with a THC cartridge. You cannot buy it as a minor, at least not here in Washington state. So it's kind of the same deal as, buying alcohol.
Right.
Teenagers can get their hands on alcohol if they really want to, but they can't openly buy it without a fake ID.
Okay, thanks.
So in the case of the THC cartridges, it appears that the culprit was an ingredient in the chemical soup contained within the cartridge. Prior to the outbreak of VAPI, vitamin E acetate was commonly used in vape cartridges as a thickening agent. Usually this was in low concentrations, less than 20% of the total. However, in 2019, there was a shortage of cannabis, and demand was outstripping supply. So unscrupulous businesses started to dump more vitamin E acetate into the mix, 50% or more of the total. The CDC has since stated that vitamin E acetate is very strongly implicated in VAPI, and the UK and Canada, as well as certain U.S. states, including Washington, Oregon, Michigan, and Ohio, have banned its use in vape products. And cases of VAPI peaked in September 2019 and then went into a steady decline. Possibly this is because experienced vapers now know to avoid cartridges that contain vitamin E acetate. Or possibly it's because cannabis supply is now keeping up with demand, and therefore less product is being doctored in this manner. But cutting vape oil with vitamin E acetate remains legal in most U.S. states, and we're talking about the drug market here. There are disreputable suppliers who pay zero attention to state and federal regulations. In short, VAPI is not the threat that it once was, but retailers are still selling vape cartridges that contain vitamin E acetate, and so the possibility of contracting lung disease is still out there.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe the biggest single downside of vaping, though, is the fact that it has a lot of appeal for teenagers. After decades of effort, cigarette smoking in the U.S. was in steady decline, but then vaping came along and turned that all around. And a big part of that is the fact that you can produce vape cartridges in a broad array of flavors.
Yes.
Flavors like mint, candy, and bubblegum are particularly popular among younger users and have been at the heart of marketing efforts by the vape companies.
Mango.
Yes. More than 80% of teen users say their first e-cigarette product was flavored. And in a 2021 study, 85% of high school students and 79% of middle school students who reported having consumed e-cigarettes within the previous 30 days did so with a flavored product.
Yeah, and let's just stop here for a quick reality check. It seems preposterous to me that the companies selling this stuff could say that this is a product for adults if they're marketing flavors like bubblegum. I mean, it's just so obvious that they were trying to hook kids.
Sure, yeah.
It doesn't pass the sniff test, you know?
Yeah. And do you remember the Joe Camel controversy from, I don't know, like 20, maybe 30 years ago?
Yeah.
When
Yep.
Marlboro cigarettes came up with a cartoon character to market their cigarettes and then tried to argue that that was just part of their adult-focused advertising.
Yeah.
So it's not a new tactic for tobacco companies. They've been
Right.
playing this game for a long time.
Right.
Studies indicate that flavored products are incorrectly perceived by these younger users to be less harmful and less addictive. We can guess that they're assuming that if it tastes like candy, it must be candy. And vaping is taking off within this youth market. Among adolescents, prevalence of cigarette smoking has dropped below 10%, but vaping is above 27%.
Wow.
According to a 2021 report by the FDA, roughly 2.55 million American teenagers had used a nicotine product within the last 30 days. Young people aged 15 to 17 are 16 times more likely to vape than people aged 25 to 34.
And is it your sense that this teen vaping has peaked? Because I've heard differing reports about that the financial problems of some of the market leaders in the vaping industry have made the whole phenomenon kind of past its peak. Is that true or not? Do you know?
I didn't see any citation of actual numbers or evidence that would indicate whether it's hit a peak. I didn't see anyone reporting that the numbers are falling off. So if it's at its peak, it's still at its peak. And I think probably we will talk about the fate of Juul as a company. I think probably one question that we don't have answered yet is how much of the growth of this teenage vaping market was a direct consequence of Juul targeting those users with their advertising, which they are no longer doing because the feds took them down. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so we can swing back around to that later.
Okay, yep.
So teens report that they first use a vape product to see what it's like. After that first use, 42% report that they continued because they like the taste, 38% because it's a social activity, and 37% because it helps them relax. Only 15% report that they vape because they think it looks cool, but I'm feeling confident that this number is underreported.
Yeah.
If I remember anything at all about my teenage years, it's that looking cool was at the very top of my priority list pretty much all of the time. And I don't think I ever really achieved that goal, but it was definitely something I thought about a lot, and especially when I was at school.
Yeah. Well, it may be that it helps them to relax and it's cool, but they're just telling you the first part and not the last part.
Right. Or maybe saying that you want to look cool is the opposite of cool, and so that's the thing that they can never report.
Yeah, good point.
So vaping is popular and possibly getting more so within the youth market, and the tobacco industry is very much aware of this fact. They see vaping as a way to get their hooks back into American consumers. Tobacco companies are major investors in vaping companies, and in 2017, they spent more than $8.6 billion on aggressive marketing, much of it aimed directly at the youth market. And here comes that company we've already been talking about. As you might already know, the poster child for tobacco ads aimed at children is a company called Juul. When the company was founded in 2004 under the name Plume, its founders described it as, quote, the rational future of smoking, unquote. In 2015, the founders sold out to a Japanese tobacco company named JTI, which relaunched the product under the name Juul later that year. But 2016 was when Juul hit the big time. Sales rose by 600%, and by November 2017, Juul had captured 1/3 of the e-cigarette market. By 2019, the company was valued at $38 billion.
Yeah.
Juul's advertising campaigns were specifically aimed at young users, presenting their product as a cool alternative to smoking. A peer-reviewed research study estimated that as much as $650 million of Juul's net revenue in 2018 came from minors.
Yep.
In April 2018, this practice of targeting young people convinced the FDA to target Juul and similar companies, sending more than 1,300 warning letters and fines to retailers accused of targeting minors with their products. In 2019, the House of Representatives opened an investigation into Juul's marketing practices. Before the end of that year, sale of Juul products had been banned in China and India. 16 U.S. states brought suit against the company for its practice of getting teenagers hooked on nicotine, and another 20 were investigating the company. Juul eventually agreed to pay $438.5 million to settle the investigation, though it did not acknowledge wrongdoing. They did, however, discontinue all their products except the tobacco and menthol-flavored varieties. Even so, in June of 2022, the FDA banned the sale or distribution of Juul products in the U.S. Juul is reportedly now seeking financing that would carry the company through Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings. So Juul might be yesterday's news, but for some reason the FDA is still allowing other companies to sell disposable e-cigarettes with flavors like blue raz lemonade, coconut melon, and kiwi passion fruit guava. And then there's the unregulated market, the largely illegal providers of vape cartridges and e-cigarettes that make no attempt to abide by state and federal regulations. Through back channels, they're selling unlabeled vape cartridges containing mystery chemicals that might have unpredictable levels of nicotine or THC. Taking down Juul did have the benefit of shutting down a company that was aggressively marketing to teenagers, but it didn't solve the problem of teenage vaping. So if you're a parent with a child who may be interested in vaping or might already be doing it, and you're concerned about the health consequences, what can you do? I did some searching online, and let me tell you, there's a lot of cringe-worthy stuff out there for parents. Campaigns with titles like "Don't Blow It" and "Vaping Isn't Cool" are more likely to make parents sound awkward and out of touch than really help them connect with their teenager. There are some evidence-based guidelines, however. First, do not try to scare your child with stories of vaping-related illness or death. All the evidence within the science of prevention says that fear does not work. Fear might help you get your teenager's attention early in the conversation, but is not going to be an effective long-term disincentive. After all, the fact that vaping can be dangerous won't necessarily convince a teenager not to do it. Lately, I've been seeing stories about young people getting injured or killed in street racing. Racing your car down public streets is quite dangerous, which isn't actually a disincentive. The fact that it's dangerous is a big part of why those kids want to do it. As Jackass and the Fast and the Furious movies have taught us, in certain contexts, risky behavior is widely regarded as cool. It raises your standing among your friends. So talking about how vaping is dangerous might actually backfire. Second principle, no blame, no shame. Keep the conversation positive and constructive. Focus on positive, desirable outcomes of not vaping. For instance, if your child is an athlete, you might talk about how steering clear of smoking and vaping will protect their lung capacity and allow for peak performance.
Yes.
That actually worked for me. I was really into sports when I was young, and when I got to the age where kids my age were trying cigarettes for the first time, I was worried about damaging my lungs. I wasn't even all that good at sports, but that was enough to keep me away from cigarettes for life.
Yeah. And also it occurs to me, no blame, no shame is good advice for talking to people about the political divide these days.
Yeah.
It serves double duty in our culture right now.
Good point. Also a related tip. It's worth sharing with your teenager the fact that popular vaping products like Juul do contain nicotine, because apparently a significant number of teenage users aren't aware of that fact. They are regularly unknowingly ingesting nicotine, possibly because their vape cartridges taste like candy. So it's worth checking in on that topic and making sure that your child is making an informed decision. And finally, you could try financial incentives. One proven method of discouraging tobacco use on the societal level is to make it more expensive. And there's also evidence that you can use financial rewards to motivate your teen to engage in desirable behaviors. In other words, money talks. Set a financial reward, something that is big enough that your teen wants to win that prize, and attach it to not vaping for a specified period of time, long enough to be challenging, but not so long that it feels out of reach. That could do the trick. The reality, though, is that vaping isn't going away, at least not anytime soon. Nowhere in my research did I hear any suggestion that vaping should be banned outright. The FDA might continue to target companies that are as brazen as Juul in targeting minors with their advertising, but there will be others to step into the breach. And we might see state or federal bans on candy-flavored vape cartridges, but if there's a demand for it, that won't stop unregulated retailers from offering that product through back channels. Prohibition failed because, at the end of the day, people really like alcohol. The war on drugs failed because Americans really like drugs. Likewise, Americans, and in particular young Americans, seem to really like nicotine and THC. If teenagers really want candy-flavored vape cartridges, they'll be able to get them one way or the other. The only way to prevent that is to focus on the demand rather than the supply. Work to understand why they want it. Choose not to criticize or judge them. Make sure that they have what they need to make informed choices, and offer positive reinforcement for decisions that have beneficial long-term consequences. Maybe that's not enough, but I feel like it's the best we can do, because the alternatives have proven themselves to be worse. But I'm not a parent, and you are, Joe. This issue is a lot more personal for you. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think a lot of things. First thing is, the reason why teenagers want nicotine is because they've been duped into consuming it by evil companies who market it as mango bubblegum flavored cartridges. And so I feel like there need to be severe consequences for that kind of behavior. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. The rush for profit made everybody look the other way at the growing teen vaping epidemic, and I feel like heads have to roll for that reason. And that's why I'm extremely interested in what the FDA decides to do on the question of e-cigarettes as smoking cessation devices. If they approve it for that purpose, then vaping will never go away. And kids will be getting hooked on vaping for generations to come, which is such a shame, because you started this presentation by talking about how nowadays smoking rates are down and vaping rates are up, Mm-hmm. But there was a time not too long ago, Mark, when smoking rates were going down and there was no alternative. Mm-hmm. So people were not getting hooked. New generations of young people were not getting hooked on nicotine. And now with the e-cigarette revolution, that's not the case anymore. So that's the first thing.
Yeah. What I would add to that is, we are totally in agreement about the culpability of companies that target minors with advertising that promotes addictive substances. I have no interest in mercy or understanding for that sort of behavior. I think why teens want this is more than the fact that Juul marketed to them. I think they want it for reasons of fitting with their friends, or they want it for reasons of dealing with anxiety, or there's something else going on there. And it's worth having that conversation to find out what are those other reasons. And if it's possible to address those reasons in ways that don't involve getting hooked on nicotine.
Yeah, so I also want to ask, so my question was whether there is any redeeming value to vaping, or is this just another scheme? And it sounds like your answer is yes and yes. There is some redeeming value to vaping, but yes, this is another scheme to hook kids. Did I interpret your answer properly?
I would not go so far as to argue that vaping was created as a scheme to hook kids. I think vaping was created as an idea that it was going to be a less harmful form of smoking, which in fact it is. Once it was there, some bad actors saw an opportunity within the flavoring landscape to leverage it as a scheme to hook kids. So I don't think it's entirely a scheme, but within certain quarters within the market, it was certainly leveraged as a scheme.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's fair, because I know that there were people involved in e-cigarette development in the early days who truly bought into the harm reduction argument. I mean, that's just a fact.
Yeah.
But I think the industry's actions speak a lot louder than their words today. You know, so marketing a highly addictive formula to kids to create the next generation of nicotine addicts speaks a lot louder than whatever words you're saying in congressional testimony about you're pushing a harm reduction device.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the tobacco industry has decades of history of thinking that consumer death is an acceptable price to pay in exchange for shareholder profit.
Yeah.
And so you can't really expect a tobacco company to use vaping in a socially beneficial manner. They'll use it in a way to increase sales. And whichever way is going to maximize sales is the direction that they're going to sell.
Yeah. And do you think some of that is because of this is like a strange marriage, this e-cigarette development project? I feel like it's a story about the marriage of Silicon Valley and big tobacco, you know? Which is a marriage made in hell from my perspective. It's like profit marries evil. And so these guys, like the founders of Juul, their name are Adam Bowen and James Monsees, public enemies number 1 and 2 as far as I'm concerned. But they thought they could do for the cigarette or to the cigarette what Steve Jobs did to the telephone, you know, like make a sleek, modern, sexy, slate gray, you know, looks like a thumb drive type of device that's going to make cigarettes cool again. But the difference is telephones, if used as designed, don't addict people and kill them. But this device, e-cigarettes, if used as designed, does addict people and eventually kill them.
Yeah. I have a more positive perspective on the tech industry than you do, but I would agree that Silicon Valley's blind spot consistently is that they believe that a technological solution is inherently better than a non-tech solution. And so they don't really ask hard questions about what's going to be the impact of this thing. And there's a whole lot of money floating around in Silicon Valley that is mostly interested in return on investment. And so a product like this one, which is essentially a technological nicotine delivery device, there are investors who think, cool, we are definitely going to be able to cash out on this one. And so the money flows towards that solution, and that's a product that gets built. And unfortunately, that's just sort of the antisocial characteristic within Silicon Valley, and it's bubbled up in a variety of ways. And in this case, though, I think the particular problem, the thing that elevated this from what it might have been, which is a less harmful form of smoking, to something which is an active detriment within society, is a fact which they might not have been thinking about early in the day, which is the flavored cartridges. The fact that you can flavor these things and you can offer something other than tobacco flavor and menthol flavor, which are the two cigarette flavors, that opened up an entirely new market. And unfortunately, yeah, you make something taste like candy and people think, this is fun. And they're not thinking this is addictive and it can make me sick.
Right. Particularly young people.
Right.
And I guess my last thought is that, boy, if there's ever a compelling rationale for government regulation, this is it. For all the right-wing naysayers who think we're an overregulated society, thank God there are some regulations and regulatory agencies like the FDA who could curb the power of this industry before it hooked every teenager in the country.
Yeah. Though my mind keeps going back to the war on drugs, where the government aggressively went after what it thought was a solution to the drug crisis, and in the process, the drug crisis got worse. There's a certain deal with the devil aspect, but it's kind of inescapable that if there's an over-the-counter regulated product that has negative social outcomes, if you drive that out of business, the product might just then go underground and become much more corrosive to society.
Yeah.
Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just got them to start buying their alcohol from organized crime.
Right.
So I do believe that the FDA's efforts were well-intentioned. I'm not sure that going after supply is the right way. I think we have to think about demand. And what I think my biggest concern with this is I didn't see a whole lot of people talking about what is at the root of this demand. And I feel like that's the crucial question. That's the question that we should be asking.
Yeah, I hear you. Unquestionably, you're right about that. But at the same time, we had done something about demand quite recently, like what I said earlier about there was a time not very long ago, 10 years ago, when smoking rates were cratering and there was no vaping alternative. So we were really licking the scourge of smoking in our country. Around the time of the Surgeon General's first warning on smoking, more than 40% of adults in the United States smoked. We had gotten smoking down to a point where less than 25% of the adult population was still smoking. Mm-hmm. And they were the old losers, the Vietnam vets with emphysema or dying away. And there wasn't cultural cachet to smoking as a young person. Young people were turning away from it. And then these sons of bitches create flavored cartridges and these sleek devices to deliver them. And all of a sudden, nicotine addiction is spiking again. I just can't get past that.
It's a fair point. My understanding is that one of the most successful ways of reducing nicotine usage was just by making tobacco products more expensive, slapping taxes on them so that you would have to pay more per pack. And so maybe that's the outcome, is just to tax the hell out of vape pens.
Yeah.
Could be that's the way to go.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for an interesting conversation. I'm not sure I feel very sanguine about the possibilities of eliminating vaping in the near future, but I sure understand a lot more about it than I did before.
Good. Are you ready for the question for next time?
Yes.
Okay. So I'd like to go meta with our next episode. As you may have heard, Mark Zuckerberg renamed his company from Facebook to Meta as a signal that he is all in on building the metaverse. That is to say, a virtual reality world which he is convinced will be the next big thing in social media, entertainment, culture, commerce, and just about everything else. Different versions of the metaverse have appeared in science fiction for decades, beginning with Neil Stephenson's 1992 sci-fi novel Snow Crash. But no one has managed to create anything in the real world that people actually want to use. Others aren't so sure about Zuck's big bet. Meta's stock price plummeted recently because the company spent $10 billion in a single year in pursuit of the metaverse, while its core businesses underperformed. Some people are saying the metaverse, or rather Zuckerberg's obsession with it, might be the thing that finally rids us of Facebook once and for all. So I'd like you to look into this, Joe, and come back with your best estimation. How far in the future is a real live metaverse? Might future episodes of Mansplaining be recorded and broadcast in virtual reality? Or is the metaverse a technological white whale that will sink every company that hunts it for many decades to come?
Well, this is truly exciting for me, Mark, and I want to tell you why. This is a first for the Mansplaining podcast. You want to hear what I mean by a first?
I do.
I was going to ask you this same question, as the next question to you after answering your question.
I beat you to it.
This is really, but it's great because it means we're both truly interested in this. So I will be happy to look into this question, since I was going to ask you to look into it next time. So,
okay, I look forward to it.
Okay, folks. If you want to comment on this episode or any other episode of the Mansplaining Podcast, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. You can like us there, check our sources, leave a comment or a question about what you just heard, and you could also suggest topics for new episodes. You can hate me and like Mark.
Yes.
Or more realistically, you can hate Mark and like me.
No.
Either way is fine with us.
So some more fine than others.
Right. You can give us a rating, write a review. And this podcast is available on many different platforms. So whatever app you use to listen to it, feel free to weigh in there. We hope that you do, because you may think we do this for ourselves, folks, but we really don't. We could be relaxing right now. I could be vaping right now. But instead, we're taping this podcast for you. So yes. Show us some love.
We could be enjoying all the many benefits of a nicotine high right now, but instead we're sober and focused on providing you with value.
Slogging away to bring this to you. Yes. But for the time being, we will say goodbye. That was Mark. I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.